In the southwestern part of the United States, in the late 1800s, lived a special breed of men known as the Gunfighters. Introducing Kenny Canada as Bill Longer, Rowan Ellsworth as Ben Thompson,
no respect for the law, victims never saw
Danny Boyd as Luke Short, and Kenny Canada as John King Fisher.
Gunfighters, just stalking by. Gunfighters, gunfighters, giving the devil one more try.
Ben Thompson was born in Yorkshire, England in 1843. He was the oldest of 4 offspring of William and Mary Thompson, and the wildest and the toughest. Shortly after Ben was born, Ben's father moved his family to Central Texas. As a young man, he was a printer, but he had a hankering for something more exciting and found it in New Orleans, where he killed his first man at the age of 17 over a woman.
Any man who rode the trail had to be constantly on his guard. Snakes, scorpions, and insects were just the normal hazards encountered. The most dangerous and the ones to be really feared were the bad men who'd spit on your dead body after they'd stripped it clean. If you had gold fillings, they'd rip out the teeth and melt the gold out later. These weren't men, they were parasites who lived to prey on others. It isn't recorded whether Ben Thompson ever ran afoul of any of these scavenger killers, but if he did, we have to assume that they didn't get a chance to relate any tales about the gunfighter with the top hat and the cane. Oh yes, he picked up a cane in his travels too and put it to deadly use many times. New Orleans, where a man could make a fortune if he played his cards right. 2 happenings changed the course of Ben's life here. He took a fancy to a rich man's top hat, and he killed his first man over a woman. Poker was Ben's favorite game, and his deadpan expression never let his opponents in a card game or in a duel warn them what his intentions were. It paid off for him in many ways. In this particular game, the affluent gambler Ben was playing with ran out of cash and started to write an IOU. Ben had been admiring the man's hat as the game progressed, and he told him that he would accept it in place of his IOU. The gambler thought Ben was joking at first, but at Ben's insistence, placed his hat on the pile of money. After all, he would be putting it back on his own head in short order. He had the winning hand, didn't he? After the other gamblers passed, the man showed his full house and eagerly reached for the big pot. His gloating was short-lived, however, as Ben exposed his own hand, 4 sixes. Ben won the hat, and it became a trademark throughout his life as a gunfighter. Of necessity, men of his ilk shied away from romantic entanglements, picking up their women whenever the opportunity arose. They rarely married, wives and kids being a yoke around their necks, curtailing their adventuresome spirits. Killing his first man was almost an effortless beginning to a career that ended the lives of over 40 men. Ben Thompson played life like a game of poker, calling each shot with a precision and calmness that awed the many witnesses to his killings. He played the gentleman at all times, always letting his opponents make the first move. Unlike his brother Bill, Ben had no thirst for killing, but didn't shy away from it when the situation warranted it. Among the many great gunfighters, Bat Masterson was quoted as saying that he thought that Ben Thompson was the most accurate, fastest gunslinger in the West. Ben stayed in New Orleans, becoming a familiar figure around the big saloons, gambling and wenching. But his thoughts soon turned to the Civil War, which was raging nearby. He heard that Colonel Baylor's Confederate regiment was camped near Austin and left to join up. Baylor, realizing it would be nearly impossible to recruit a regiment in the West, got his men by setting up the biggest buffalo hunt ever attempted. Calling for 1,000 men to join him and bring their own weapons, Baylor finally whipped them into a fighting force to be reckoned with. Maybe it was only a ragtag army with no uniforms supplied, but they wound up establishing the Arizona Territory for the Confederate cause. Ben got along well with most of the men who were from small villages and towns in Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado, just like himself. They joined up with the clothes on their backs, some with horses, some without, and only once in a while were they able to get a change of clothing during a skirmish or a raid on Union strongholds. Supplies were like getting Christmas presents, few and far between. They survived by their wits and what they could scrounge from their civilian allies or acquire from their enemies. In a way, they were more guerrillas than regular army. Some of the enlisted cadre were issued uniforms, Ben's sergeant being one of the lucky ones. Ben was a thorn in his side from the moment he enlisted. The regimentation he could handle, it being a necessary part of war, but the sergeant took a fiendish delight in harassing Ben in front of the other men. A showdown was inevitable. The sergeant, like most regulars, was cocky, arrogant, and self-assured. He laughed as Ben told him to draw. He'd teach this rookie a lesson he'd never forget. Fumbling for his pistol, he was no match for Ben Thompson. Ben didn't stay around to find out whether or not the other men were happy over their sergeant's sudden demise. The fact that they didn't pursue him may have a bearing on their attitude, or maybe they just had more respect for Ben's gun than the sergeant had. He deserted then and there, deciding that he'd had enough of army life. There is no record of his being confronted with his desertion or killing his sergeant. And with their cause losing ground rapidly, the Confederate Army had far more serious problems to face. Hitting the trail again, he headed for Austin to freshen up and decide what he was going to do next. Gunfighters like Ben all had one thing in common, a thorough understanding of the capabilities and logistics of their weapons, what they could do and what they could not do with them. Always on the lookout for superior pistols, they had an advantage over most other men: time. Because they didn't work in the usual sense, gunfighters like Ben, when they were on the trail alone with nothing to disturb their thoughts, used the time to their advantage. The knowledge of how far a particular weapon could be fired accurately to the exact foot, or how many grains of black powder were needed for maximum velocity, were among the many survival thoughts that these gunfighters shared, each in his own way. The fast draw was highly important, each man reworking or changing his holster for a smooth, catchless draw. Many a man died because his pistol got snagged or hung up in the holster because he hadn't bothered to cut off a quarter of an inch of leather in the right place. Little things that spelled death for the man who wasn't fully prepared. Ben made sure that he had all the advantages offered. Ben was always well-dressed, and whenever in town, made frequent trips to the local barber shop. One day, while having his usual shave, a bad man, Jim Coombs, came in to freshen up. Seeing his wanted ad in the local paper, he made the mistake of threatening the barber in order to get rid of the idiot that he was shaving, Ben Thompson. Ben didn't realize until later whom he had killed. By this time, he was beginning to lose count. With hardly a glance at his victim, who had dared to cause the barber to nick his face with a razor, Ben leisurely spruced himself up and took his leave. He headed south for the border, having heard that Emperor Maximilian was looking for American sharpshooters to train and fight with his forces in Mexico. Ben figured that he could be useful to the Emperor inasmuch as he had just served a brief hitch with the Confederate Army. He could have gone on to become one of the great bank robbers of his day, but whether from his religious upbringing or personal morals, there are no recorded instances of him ever having used his gunslinging abilities to gain his fortune illegally. Having no other skills besides printing, and with his love for the outdoors and desire to travel, he just seemed to fall into the life of the gunfighter. His gambling was a very personal and calculated expression of his life. He was not a cheat, as were so many of the men that he played with, and he probably took great satisfaction in ridding the world of a few of these undesirable characters. Arriving in Nuevo Laredo, it didn't take long for Ben Thompson to add a few more notches to his pistol and do a favor for a Mexican who turned out to be just the man that he was looking for. Maximilian, like the Confederate Army, didn't have the funds to supply most of his men with the lavish and colorful uniforms that some of his troops wore. Ben had no way of knowing ahead of time that he saved the life of one of Maximilian's recruiters. Another insight into this gunfighter's psychological makeup, coming to the aid of a stranger when the odds were against him. He was a firm believer in playing his hunches without questioning them. 3-to-1 odds seemed an easy gamble to Ben as he gunned down two of the bandidos and took the other one in the throat with his cane. Helping the Mexican up, Ben introduced himself and found out who the man was. Over a bottle of tequila, Ben's first priority was reloading his pistol. Unlike the metal cartridges, which were to be invented in a very short time, ammunition comprised of a ball, black powder, a patch, and a percussion cap. These all had to be loaded individually. There were many times unwary men blew their mouths and tongues apart, biting the wrong side of these percussion caps. As you can see, loading a full cylinder, 6 shots, could take a minimum of 2.5 minutes of studied concentration. So much for the Hollywood sharpshooters. After reloading and satisfied with the answers he received, Ben signed up and took off to meet with the recruiter later. He didn't have long to wait at the appointed spot as the Mexican sergeant arrived with 2 of his soldiers. The sergeant had probably filled them in on Ben's lightning draw and how his life had been saved. They all circled Ben and gave this gringo the once-over. The sergeant then introduced him to the others. After sharing a flask of wine, they all took off for the Mexican interior for Ben to start his duties. These men were eagerly looking forward to having a professional gunfighter of Ben Thompson's caliber train them and fight with them. Unfortunately, it was a wasted trip for Ben. The news reached his training camp that Emperor Maximilian had been executed before he hardly had time to make any headway with the local lovely ladies, let alone teach any of the men how to fast draw. His newly acquired friend, the Mexican sergeant, rode with Ben back to the border, paying him off and thanking him for his help, even if it had been short-lived. Ben hit the trail north through Texas and Oklahoma to Kansas, where he was to meet up with his brother Bill. And had sent word to his brother Ben to meet him in Kansas. His escapades in the area had left a trail of dead men behind him. Unlike Ben, Bill reveled in gunplay just for the sake of killing. They met and camped at the outskirts of Ellsworth, Kansas. Catching up on each other's adventures, they decided to team up for a while, and it is said that during their brief sojourn together, they raised quite a bit of hell, and between them shot down at least 25 men. While they were talking over old times, they were not aware of being watched. Hidden in the bushes, one of Sheriff Whitney's sons watched these strangers, trying to determine if they were a threat to his small town. Wireless was not to be invented until 1895, so the only means of communication between towns and villages was by couriers on horseback, who oftentimes carried the mailbags, or by stagecoach. This made small settlements easy prey for men intent on robbery and looting, so it forced everyone to be extremely cautious of strangers in the area. Being a sheriff's son, the young man kept cool and studied Ben and Bill. Anything that he could learn about them while they were off guard would help his father determine what action to take. Getting more suspicious as he watched Ben and Bill, seeing the variety of their weapons and their obvious intention to start into town, the young man was about to leave when Ben began putting on his coat and his now famous top hat. Ben's fame had preceded him to Ellsworth. The youth knew who he was, and he wasn't going to stick around and get caught by these killers. After having checked their equipment, Ben and Bill proceeded into Ellsworth at a leisurely pace, little realizing that their presence had been spotted. The odds of anyone finding their camp were pretty slim. The only reason the boy had found them were the curls of smoke that he had seen in the air and had gone to investigate. With no fire going, Ben and Bill gave no thought to it being discovered. All that Ben and Bill were anticipating were a hot tub, a change of underwear, a shave, and a general freshening up, and maybe a little dallying with the local bar girls. The youngster was hightailing it back into town to tell his father the disturbing news. The outskirts of Ellsworth, where the sheriff's office was located, was not unlike most western towns, infested with weeds and in a run-down-looking condition. A center for the outlying ranchers and cowboys to come get their supplies and whoop it up on the weekend. Until the railroads and the wireless really opened up the West, these small communities more or less had to shift for themselves. As soon as Sheriff C.B. Whitney saw his son galloping into town, he knew that something was up. When his excited boy quickly explained who was coming, the sheriff lost no time in setting up his defenses. Not that Ben was the type who initiated violence, but the sheriff was taking no chances with his ruthless brother Bill.
When they rode into town, folks would try to gun them down, but the gunfighters always were prepared. They survived by their speed, killing first became the creed, but the gunfighters told his holsters bare. Gunfighters, gunfighters, they're stalking by. Gunfighters, gunfighters, giving the devil one more try.
With both the sheriff and one of his deputies dead at his brother's hand, Ben started getting mad. Shooting the other deputy, he strode out into the middle of the street, screaming at the rest of the ambushers to come out and fight like men. In the meantime, a young man ran into the back of the mayor's office. He was unarmed. The mayor was reluctant, but gave in and supplied the young man with what he asked for. Checking the pistols quickly but carefully, he took a deep breath. Without hesitation, left the mayor's office. While Ben was taunting the rest of the scared townspeople, young Wyatt Earp strode up quickly behind him. Hearing the clicks and the youthful voice behind him, Ben followed one of his strange hunches and let Wyatt Earp disarm him and lead him off to jail. This was one of the rare times that Ben was ever completely taken by surprise. As mad as he was at the ambush, he was calm enough to follow his hunch and thereby save his own life. It's possible that with Ben's speed and lightning reflexes, he might have turned and killed Wyatt, but his own body would have received at least one bullet from Wyatt's guns. Had this happened, Wyatt Earp's name would never have become world-renowned. The big difference between Bill and Ben was clearly evident as Bill fled town. Ben would probably have burst into jail with guns blazing to get his brother out. Ben was given a swift trial, and after hearing the evidence, the circuit judge gave his verdict. Upon hearing the verdict, young Wyatt Earp inwardly fumed. This wasn't the kind of justice he expected after having risked his life. Ben paid his fine, and the judge returned his pistol and belt to him. There was nothing that they could hold Ben for. Someone had come forward and stated that they had seen the deputy fire at Ben before he shot him, so he had to be acquitted. This type of dispensing justice was probably the seed that was planted in Wyatt Earp's young mind and spurred him on to become the great gunfighter he turned out to be, on the right side of the law. As Ben left, however, with his sense of fair play outraged, young Wyatt immediately went up to the judge and turned in his badge, then stomped off, determined to see that men like Ben Thompson will be taken care of, one way or the other. Ben left town and went to the campsite to see if Bill were there. His brother must have left a note for Ben to meet him in Austin later. While Ben was on the trail, Bill was captured and returned to Ellsworth, and ironically was acquitted for the sheriff's killing, because the sheriff had his gun out.